Judge Michael Bennett's polished dress shoes clicked against the marble floors of the courthouse, echoing through the still empty corridors of the early morning. He'd arrived at his usual time, 7:30 a.m., well before the day's proceedings were set to begin. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the building's historic interior. As he made his way to his chambers, the familiar scent of coffee wafted from the break room, where his clerk, James, was already preparing their morning ritual. The courthouse security guards nodded respectfully as he passed, their "Good morning, Your Honor" carrying the same deference it had for the past 8 years. Inside his chambers, Bennett settled into his leather chair, its worn comfort a testament to countless hours of deliberation. He reached for the stack of case files James had meticulously prepared the evening before. Traffic violations, minor disputes, petty misdemeanors, the usual Monday morning docket. He allowed himself a small sigh. These cases weren't the reason he'd spent years at law school, but he took pride in running an efficient courtroom. The morning news played quietly on his small desktop television. Another story about urban crime rates rising, another debate about judicial reform. Bennett barely listened anymore. He'd developed his own philosophy about justice, swift, certain, and unwavering. His colleagues often praised his ability to move through cases efficiently, maintaining order in what could otherwise become a chaotic system. "Your Honor." James appeared at the door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Today's docket has 23 cases. Officer Thompson has 4 traffic violations to present, and there's a property dispute that might take some time." He placed 1 cup on Bennett's desk, steam rising in lazy spirals. Bennett nodded, taking a sip of the perfectly prepared coffee. Black, no sugar, just like his father, another judge, had taught him. "Any unusual cases we should be aware of?" "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir, though there is 1 stop sign violation being contested. The defendant has requested to present video evidence." Bennett resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Everyone had an excuse, a story, a reason why the rules shouldn't apply to them. In his experience, clear boundaries and consistent consequences were the backbone of a functioning society. His father's words echoed in his mind. The law doesn't bend for tears or tales. As he donned his judicial robes, Bennett caught his reflection in the window. At 45, his hair had started graying at the temples, lending him what he hoped was an air of additional gravitas. The dark robes settled on his shoulders with familiar weight, a reminder of the authority and responsibility he carried. The first hints of courthouse activity drifted through his door. Voices in the hallway, the shuffle of feet, the distant ding of the elevator. Soon, the morning's parade of traffic offenders, minor disputes, and small claims would begin. Bennett straightened his tie, checked his appearance 1 final time, and gathered the files he'd need for the first session. Time to maintain order in the chaos, he murmured to himself, a personal mantra of sorts. Little did he know that this mundane Monday would become a turning point in his career, challenging everything he thought he knew about justice, bias, and the very nature of order itself. The morning proceeded exactly as Judge Bennett expected until case number 47B crossed his desk. Dr. Sarah Washington strode into the courtroom at precisely 10:45 a.m., her presence immediately commanding attention despite her unassuming demeanor. She wore a charcoal gray suit that spoke of quiet sophistication, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Officer Thompson, a veteran of the force with 15 years of experience, stood at the prosecution table. His crisp uniform and rigid posture projected the image of unwavering authority that Bennett had come to expect and appreciate in his courtroom. The officer's body camera footage screen was already set up, standard procedure for traffic violations. Case number 47B, traffic violation at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street, Bennett's clerk announced, his voice carrying through the now hushed courtroom. Dr. Washington placed her weathered leather briefcase on the defense table, removing several documents with practiced precision. A manila envelope marked Video Evidence sat prominently atop her papers. She'd rushed straight from teaching her constitutional law seminar at Georgetown, where she'd spent the morning discussing the evolution of judicial discretion with bright-eyed second-year students. "Your Honor," Officer Thompson began, his testimony flowing with the polish of someone who'd presented hundreds of similar cases. "At approximately 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, March 12th, I observed the defendant's vehicle, a silver Toyota Camry, failed to come to a complete stop at the designated stop sign. The violation was clear and unambiguous." Bennett noticed how Dr. Washington listened intently, her expression neutral save for the slight arch of her eyebrow. She maintained the composure of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings, though not in the way he assumed. Her fingers moved across her papers, organizing them with methodical care. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows cast interesting shadows across the courtroom, highlighting the proud line of Dr. Washington's jaw and the quiet confidence in her bearing. She seemed almost amused by the proceedings, though she maintained perfect courtroom decorum. "Dr. Washington," Bennett addressed her, glancing briefly at the citation. "You've chosen to contest this violation. Do you understand that if found guilty, you'll be subject to both the fine and court costs?" "I understand completely, Your Honor," she replied, her voice carrying the rich timbre of someone accustomed to lecture halls and academic debates. "I've prepared evidence that I believe will shed some light on this situation." From the gallery, a young law student watched intently, scribbling notes. He'd followed his professor to court that day, eager to see the legendary Dr. Washington in action. She'd mentioned using real-world examples in their next class discussion on judicial procedure. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background as Officer Thompson played his body camera footage. The grainy video showed the silver Camry approaching the stop sign, but the angle made it difficult to determine if a complete stop had occurred. Dr. Washington waited patiently, her hand resting on the manila envelope containing her own evidence. Judge Bennett watched the footage with the slightly detached air of someone who'd seen thousands of similar cases. His fingers drummed lightly on his desk, his wedding ring catching the morning light. He'd already begun mentally composing his ruling, following the familiar groove of countless traffic violations before this one. He had no way of knowing that in the next few moments, his carefully ordered world would begin to unravel, all because of the evidence waiting in that manila envelope and the woman who stood ready to present it. "Your Honor, if I may present my evidence," Dr. Washington began, reaching for the manila envelope. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, despite the judge's obvious impatience. The young law student in the gallery leaned forward, pen poised above his notepad. Judge Bennett raised his hand, cutting her off mid-motion. "I've seen enough, Dr. Washington. The officer's footage clearly shows a violation." His voice carried the weight of authority he cultivated over 8 years on the bench, the same tone that had silenced countless excuses and explanations before. A subtle shift occurred in Dr. Washington's expression, not quite disappointment, not exactly surprise, but something deeper. She'd spent decades studying these moments in courtrooms, analyzing them in academic papers, teaching about them in her seminars. Now she was experiencing one firsthand. "Your Honor, I have traffic camera footage that shows a different angle of the intersection," she persisted, her voice maintaining its professional calm. The envelope remained unopened in her hands, its contents unexamined. Bennett felt a flutter of irritation. Monday mornings were busy enough without prolonged discussions about clear-cut violations. "Dr. Washington, this court appreciates your preparation, but Officer Thompson's testimony and evidence are sufficient. This isn't a classroom where we can debate theoretical perspectives." A few heads in the gallery turned at his dismissive tone. Officer Thompson shifted slightly at his table, his expression unreadable. The young law student's pen scratched rapidly across his notepad, documenting every word. "Given your professional standing, I expected better judgment," Bennett continued, shuffling the papers on his desk. "The fine will be $300, plus court costs. This is double the standard fee, considering your attempt to waste the court's time with unnecessary evidence. The silence that followed his pronouncement felt heavier than usual. Dr. Washington stood perfectly still, her hands now folded neatly in front of her. The morning sunlight continued its path across the courtroom floor, indifferent to the drama unfolding above it. "For the record, Your Honor," she spoke again, each word measured and clear, "I would like to note my objection to this ruling and your refusal to examine exculpatory evidence. The precedent set in Thompson v. Louisville clearly establishes." The citation of case law caught Bennett off guard. Traffic offenders didn't typically quote Supreme Court decisions. He felt a small crack in his certainty, but pushed forward anyway. "Your objection is noted," he interrupted, reaching for his gavel. "This court's decision is final. Next case." Dr. Washington began gathering her materials, moving with the same measured grace she'd shown throughout the proceeding. But before stepping away from the podium, she spoke one final time, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach the bench. "I find it interesting, Your Honor, that you've chosen to demonstrate exactly what I lectured about this morning: the dangers of presumptive judgment and the importance of examining all available evidence. My students will find this case study particularly illuminating." Something about her words, about the way she delivered them, tugged at Bennett's memory. A lecture hall from years ago flickered at the edges of his consciousness, but he pushed the thought away. He had 17 more cases to hear before lunch. As Dr. Washington turned to leave, the young law student rose from his seat, clutching his notepad like a shield. The morning sun caught the Georgetown Law logo on his laptop bag, and for a moment, Judge Bennett felt an inexplicable unease settle over him, as if he'd missed something vitally important. The next case was already being called when Dr. Washington's words finally penetrated Judge Bennett's consciousness. Her voice, that particular way she emphasized presumptive judgment, triggered something in his mind. He found himself suddenly transported back 15 years, to a sunlit lecture hall at Georgetown Law. "Next case, Your Honor," his clerk prompted, noticing the judge's unusual hesitation. But Bennett barely heard him. In his mind, he was once again a second-year law student, sitting in the third row of Professor Washington's constitutional law class. The memory hit him with stunning clarity. Her standing at the podium, chalk dust on her fingers, drawing a complex diagram about judicial bias on the blackboard. "Your Honor." The clerk's voice seemed to come from far away. Bennett's hands began to feel cold as more memories cascaded through his mind. Professor Washington's office hours, where she'd spent an extra 30 minutes helping him understand the nuances of the Equal Protection Clause. The letter of recommendation she'd written that helped launch his clerkship. Her passionate speeches about the responsibility of judicial power. His voice cracked slightly. "I need a 15-minute recess." The words had barely left his mouth before he was rising from the bench, his robes suddenly feeling too heavy, too constraining. He could feel the confused stares of the courthouse staff, the murmurs from the gallery. Dr. Washington had almost reached the courtroom doors, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. In his chambers, Bennett collapsed into his chair, his breath coming in short gasps. The gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. He'd just dismissed, diminished, and fined his former professor, one of the most respected legal scholars in constitutional law, without even allowing her to present evidence. More memories surfaced. Professor Washington's first lecture of the semester, words that had been burned into his brain. "The greatest threat to justice isn't always malice," she had said, "but the comfortable certainty that we're above the very biases we condemn in others." His phone buzzed, a notification from the Georgetown Law Review. The irony felt like a physical blow when he saw the headline. Dr. Sarah Washington's latest publication, Implicit Bias in Modern Judicial Practice. A field study. The article had been published just last week. Through his chamber window, he could see Dr. Washington in the courthouse parking lot, speaking with the young law student who'd been in the gallery. She was gesturing animatedly, clearly turning even this moment into a teaching opportunity. The student was taking notes, nodding eagerly. Bennett's own voice from 15 minutes ago echoed in his head. This isn't a classroom where we can debate theoretical perspectives. But that's exactly what his courtroom had become. A living demonstration of the very principles she'd spent decades teaching. He reached for his phone, then pulled back. What could he possibly say? Sorry, I just embodied everything you warned us about 15 years ago. The weight of his actions, the layers of irony, felt suffocating. A knock at his chamber door made him jump. His clerk stood there, looking concerned. Your Honor, should I reschedule the remaining cases? Bennett straightened in his chair, his decision crystallizing. No, James, but when we resume, I need you to do something. Find Dr. Washington. Tell her. He took a deep breath. Tell her Judge Bennett requests her return to the courtroom. Her former student needs to correct a grievous error. In the suffocating silence of his chambers, Judge Bennett stared at the framed oath of office hanging on his wall. The words equal justice under law seemed to mock him now. His fingers trembled as he pulled open his desk drawer, retrieving a leather-bound notebook from his law school days. The pages fell open naturally to a dog-eared section. There, in his younger self's rushed handwriting, were notes from Professor Washington's lectures. Justice is blind, but judges are human, she had said. Our experiences, our biases, our presumptions, they color every decision we make unless we actively guard against them. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Washington is waiting in the anteroom. Your Honor, James announced, his voice careful, neutral. Bennett closed his eyes, memories continuing to assault him. That time in her office, discussing his judicial aspirations. Michael, she had said, the hardest cases won't be the complex ones. They'll be the simple ones where you're so certain you're right that you stop questioning yourself. How many other times had he done this? How many cases had he rushed through, confident in his swift judgment? He pulled up his case history on the computer. Patterns began emerging that made his stomach churn. Subtle differences in fine amounts, variations in how much time he allowed for testimony, distinctions in how he addressed different defendants. The young law student's notebook from the gallery lay forgotten on a nearby chair, apparently left behind in the chaos. A page had fallen open, revealing hastily scribbled observations. Judge shows immediate dismissal of evidence. Clear demonstration of authority bias. Professor Washington maintains composure despite clear procedural oversight. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the Judicial Review Board. Their quarterly performance metrics praising his efficient case management and decisive ruling style. The words that had once filled him with pride now felt like indictments. Through his window, he could see the courthouse square, where lawyers and defendants milled about during the recess. A group of law students had gathered around Dr. Washington, their expressions animated as she apparently turned this moment into an impromptu lesson. Even now, she was teaching. Bennett loosened his collar, feeling the weight of his judicial robes like never before. On his desk, a photo caught his eye. His graduation from Georgetown Law. He was beaming in his cap and gown, and there in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Professor Washington, applauding as he received his diploma. The crisis wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Every principle she had taught him, every lesson about justice and fairness, he had managed to violate in less than 15 minutes. The very biases she had warned their class about, he had demonstrated with stunning efficiency. His computer screen still showed the morning's docket. 23 cases, each one representing a life, a story, evidence that deserved to be heard. How many Dr. Washingtons had stood before him, their evidence dismissed, their voices silenced by his certainty. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the end of the recess period. In 5 minutes, he would have to face her again, not as the eager student he had once been, but as the cautionary tale he had become. The courtroom awaited, but this time, he knew, the real judgment would not come from the bench. He stood up, straightened his robes, and took a deep breath. The hardest lesson of his career was about to begin. taught by the same professor who had tried to prevent it 15 years ago. The bailiffs all rise echoed through the courtroom as Judge Bennett returned to the bench. The usual shuffling of feet and murmurs felt amplified in his heightened state of awareness. Dr. Washington sat at the defendant's table, her posture as dignified as when she'd stood at the lectern in Georgetown 15 years ago. Before we continue with the remaining cases, Bennett began, his voice steadier than he felt. I need to address a matter of significant importance. The routine chatter in the gallery died down immediately, this deviation from normal procedure catching everyone's attention. His eyes met Dr. Washington's, where he expected to find judgment or satisfaction. He saw only the same patient expression she'd worn when explaining complex legal theories to struggling students. The manila envelope still sat unopened before her. Dr. Sarah Washington, he continued, his words carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. 15 years ago, you taught a class on judicial responsibility at Georgetown Law. You spoke about the dangers of presumptive judgment and the sacred duty of true judicial review. The young law student who had returned to the gallery was scribbling frantically again. Officer Thompson straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to interest. I was in that class, Bennett admitted, watching surprise register on several faces. I sat in the third row, by the window. I took notes about judicial bias and the importance of examining all evidence. I wrote papers about the very principles I violated today in this courtroom. Dr. Washington's face remained neutral, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that made it hard for him to maintain eye contact. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. This court. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. This court made a grievous error in refusing to examine your evidence. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly the kind of biased judgment you warned us about all those years ago. He could see his clerk, James, watching with wide eyes. The routine morning had transformed into something none of them had expected. I moved to vacate the previous ruling, Bennett declared, each word deliberate and clear. Dr. Washington, with the court's deepest apologies, I request that you present your evidence now, as you should have been allowed to do initially. As Dr. Washington rose to approach the bench, Bennett noticed details he'd overlooked in his earlier haste. The small pin on her lapel marking her as a recipient of the American Bar Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, the confident way she handled her materials speaking to decades of legal expertise. Thank you, Your Honor, she responded, her voice carrying the same educational tone he remembered from her lectures. Though I must say, you've just provided my current students with a more powerful lesson in judicial integrity than any lecture could deliver. The manila envelope was finally opened. As Dr. Washington began presenting her evidence, Bennett leaned forward, determined to demonstrate the kind of careful attention and review he should have shown from the start. The morning sun continued its path across the courtroom floor, illuminating what had become an unexpected masterclass in justice, humility, and the courage to correct one's mistakes. The regular audience of the traffic court had grown as word spread through the courthouse. Lawyers, clerks, and other court officers found reasons to slip into the gallery, witnessing something rare. A judge publicly acknowledging his bias and working to correct it in real time. Dr. Washington's traffic camera footage played on the courtroom screen with crystal clarity. The timestamp matched the morning in question, and the angle captured the intersection of Maple and 4th Street perfectly. The silver Camry came to a complete 3-second stop before proceeding. Textbook compliance with traffic law. Officer Thompson leaned forward in his seat, his professional demeanor unchanged, but his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched. His body camera footage, taken from a different angle, had created an optical illusion that made the stop appear rolling rather than complete. As you can see, Your Honor, Dr. Washington explained, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used in countless lectures. The elevation of the intersection and the angle of approach created a perspective issue in the original footage. This secondary angle provides the necessary context. Bennett watched the video play through a second time, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom studying his reaction. The evidence wasn't just clear, It was irrefutable. His earlier dismissal of it seemed even more egregious now. "The court thanks you for this comprehensive evidence, Dr. Washington," Bennett said, noting how foreign the words felt, too formal for addressing someone who had shaped his legal understanding. "Given this new evidence, the citation is dismissed, and all fees are waived." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Several of the waiting defendants exchanged glances, perhaps wondering if their own evidence would receive similar attention now. The young law student's pen hadn't stopped moving since the video began playing. But Dr. Washington wasn't finished. She pulled out a second document from her briefcase. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence, not for this case, but for your consideration. This is a study I recently completed on prospective bias in traffic court rulings across 3 states. The paper's title page bore the Georgetown law letterhead, Visual Perspective in Traffic Violations, a study of technological and human bias in urban intersections. The study demonstrates how certain intersection designs can create consistent visual misinterpretations, particularly in body camera footage," she explained. "We found that these perspective issues disproportionately affect citation rates in certain communities." Officer Thompson had risen from his seat, professional interest evident in his expression. "Professor," he interjected, "would this research be available to our department's training division?" Bennett watched the interaction unfold, seeing how a moment of potential conflict was transforming into an opportunity for systemic improvement. Dr. Washington was doing what she'd always done: teaching, enlightening, pushing for better understanding. The court would also be very interested in reviewing this research, Bennett added, his earlier embarrassment giving way to genuine professional curiosity. "Perhaps." He hesitated, then continued, "Perhaps you would be willing to conduct a training session for our judicial staff." Dr. Washington smiled, the same smile he remembered from when a student finally grasped a complex legal concept. "I believe that could be arranged, Your Honor. After all, the best lessons often come from real-world examples." The morning sun had reached its peak outside, casting the courtroom in full light. The remaining defendants in the gallery watched with renewed interest, witnesses to an unusual transformation, a courtroom becoming a classroom, a mistake becoming a teaching moment, and justice being served in more ways than one. 1 month later, the same courtroom buzzed with different energy. Instead of traffic defendants, it was filled with judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers from across the district. Dr. Washington stood at the podium. But this time, she wasn't defending herself. She was leading the first session of a comprehensive training program on bias recognition and evidence evaluation. Judge Bennett sat in the front row, his notepad open just as it had been 15 years ago in her classroom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that he'd gone from being her student to a judge, and now back to being her student again. His wedding ring clinked against the metal pen as he took detailed notes, determined not to forget a single insight. "Perspective bias isn't just about camera angles," Dr. Washington explained, using their now famous traffic stop as a case study. "It's about the angles from which we view every situation that comes before us in court." She clicked to the next slide, showing a compilation of intersection footage from various angles. Officer Thompson, who had become an unexpected ally in this initiative, stood up to share his own insights. "What we see as law enforcement officers isn't always the complete picture," he admitted, gesturing to the visual examples. "This training has already changed how our department handles traffic camera evidence." In the month since the incident, changes had rippled through the courthouse. Bennett had implemented a mandatory evidence review period for all cases, no matter how routine they seemed. His average case time had increased by 7 minutes, but the appeal rate had dropped by 40%. The young law student who had witnessed the original incident was now interning at the courthouse, part of a new program designed to bring academic oversight to judicial proceedings. His original notes from that day had been photocopied and distributed as part of the training materials, a reminder of how obvious bias can be to outside observers. "The true measure of justice," Dr. Washington continued, her voice carrying the same passion it had 15 years ago, "isn't in how quickly we make decisions, but in how carefully we consider all perspectives before making them. Bennett watched his fellow judges nodding, taking notes, engaging with the material. Some had been skeptical when he first proposed this training program, but the data from his own courtroom's improvements had been convincing. His willingness to share his mistake had opened the door for others to examine their own practices. After the session, Dr. Washington approached him with a familiar manila envelope, the same one from that fateful morning. "I thought you might want to keep this, Michael," she said, using his first name for the first time since their paths had crossed again. Sometimes the best teaching tools are our own moments of revelation. Inside the envelope was not just the traffic camera footage, but a copy of his old constitutional law final paper from Georgetown. She had kept it all these years, an A-plus paper about the importance of judicial impartiality and thorough evidence review. "You knew exactly who I was that morning, didn't you?" he asked, finally voicing the question that had bothered him for weeks. "Sometimes," she replied with a gentle smile. "The most powerful lessons are the ones we have to learn twice." As the afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the now empty courtroom, Bennett carefully placed the envelope in his chambers. Next to his oath of office, he hung a new frame containing a simple quote from that day: "Justice isn't just about being right. It's about being willing to recognize when we're wrong." The gavel sat silent on his bench, waiting for tomorrow's cases, but now it would serve not just as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of humility, growth, and the endless journey of learning to see justice from all angles.